He heard Grandma talking to someone, and his mind calmed a little. "Thank God Mama is outside," he muttered, and then he wore his shirt. "Ibn Abo," he heard Grandma call once. He grabbed the door handle and was about to twist it when he heard Grandma's voice again, and then he paused. "You will remain a goat as long as I'm still alive. Ibn Abo, you turned my son's eyes against me. He no longer gave me the amount of money he used to give me as soon as he married you. And you expect me to be happy with you? You will remain like this till I think of how to get rid of you, maybe sell you off or something, because ever since I turned you into a goat, I have started enjoying back my son." Jeffrey froze while goosebumps filled his entire body from head to toe. But he was curious. He needed to be sure of what he heard because Ibn Abo was his uncle's wife's name, the one that went missing. Jeffrey's uncle's wife once traveled to the village from the city to take care of his sick grandmother, but she never returned. She went missing in the village. Jeffrey's father and uncle went from the city to the village in search of her. They even reported to the local vigilante men, but nothing could be done. Even Grandma said that she last saw her on the first day she arrived in the village. She had left the house and never returned. Months and years went by, but still there was no news of her. Her children, who were just kids when she left, were now approaching adulthood. Their father took care of them all by himself. After about 10 years of no news of her, Jeffrey's family went to the village one Christmas. Jeffrey hadn't visited the village for 11 years, and he was just 8 the last time he did. So his dad, mum, siblings, and he visited after a long time. Grandma had a female black goat. The first day they arrived at the village in Grandma's house, it stood still, staring at Jeffrey from afar when he was coming down from the car. He looked at it, and then he thought maybe he was just imagining things, and looked away. After exchanging pleasantries with Grandma, he was following his other siblings into the house, walking side by side with Grandma, with her hand around his shoulders. He turned and looked at the goat again. She wouldn't take her eyes off him. He became so uneasy. He didn't know why. But each time he felt that way, it meant there was something his instincts were trying to communicate. The goat would always pursue Jeffrey around whenever she saw him outside, and Grandma would command her to stop, and she would do so immediately. At a point, he became scared to come out of the house. He even told Dad several times to allow them to leave the village, but the man would laugh at him and ask if he was leaving just because of a goat. 5 days later, Jeffrey was tired of staying indoors, so he picked a shirt from his bag, hung it on his left shoulder, and was walking on tiptoe toward the entrance door. He was going to peep through the entrance door to see if the goat was anywhere around before racing out of the house. He heard Grandma talking to someone, and his mind calmed a little. "Thank God Mama is outside," he muttered, and then he wore his shirt. "Ibn Abo," he heard Grandma call once. He grabbed the door handle and was about to twist it when he heard Grandma's voice again, and then he paused. "You will remain a goat as long as I'm still alive. Ibn Abo, you turned my son's eyes against me. He no longer gave me the amount of money he used to give me as soon as he married you. And you expect me to be happy with you? You will remain like this till I think of how to get rid of you, maybe sell you off or something, because ever since I turned you into a goat, I have started enjoying back my son." Jeffrey froze while goosebumps filled his entire body from head to toe. But he was curious. He needed to be sure of what he heard because Ibn Abo was his uncle's wife's name, the one that went missing. He gently twisted the door handle, opening the door halfway. He then peeped through the little space, and the first thing he saw was Grandma's hands. She was holding leaves and feeding the goat with them. He needed to satisfy his curiosity, so he peeped further and saw the shocker of his life. The black goat was standing beside Grandma, but it now had the head of his missing uncle's wife. "Ibn Abo," Grandma continued, "eat them. This is what you will continue eating as long as I live. Maybe whenever I'm broke, I might consider selling you off, but just remain this way for now." Jeffrey started to shiver and didn't even know how to return quietly to his room without her noticing his presence. He started to sweat profusely, but he was also catching cold. His stomach started to rumble too. He became so pressed that he needed to use the toilet. He left the entrance quietly, taking a step or two backward, paused for a second, and then retreated into his room. He had never been so terrified all his life. He rushed into the toilet, sat there for a few seconds, and also tried to comprehend what he had just witnessed, but the urge to use the toilet had vanished. He returned to the room and started to pace up and down. Then he managed to sit on the edge of the bed. How is it possible? That Auntie Ibn Abo is the black goat, he asked himself rhetorically, with his gaze fixed. And then the door opened. He jerked as soon as he heard the sound of the door, with his heart almost popping out of his chest. It was Mom. "Jeffrey, you look worried. What is it?" she asked. Mom, can you believe that Grandma's black goat is the missing Auntie Ibn Abo? Are you high on something? Did what you just let out make any sense to you? Goat is Ibn Abo. I don't understand, said Mom, standing before him and staring at him. Jeffrey stood up all of a sudden and then moved closer to her. He approached the windows and raised the curtains to be sure no one was listening to their conversation. Mom, I was going to sneak out when I overheard Grandma talking with someone. I opened the door quietly and I saw the goat standing before her. The goat had Auntie Ibn Abo's head, he said in whispers, and Mom covered his mouth with her palm all of a sudden, with the other hand grabbing his neck. She turned and looked around the room as if another person was there with them. Shh, she whispered, and then uncovered his mouth. Are you telling me the truth? Mom questioned in whispers, staring straight into his eyes. I swear, he whispered back, touching his tongue with his index finger and then raising the same finger in the air to show how truthful he was. Mom paused for a few seconds and then looked at him. Where are they? She asked, and he pointed toward the front door. Outside, he said. Mom turned and walked towards his room door. To where? He asked all of a sudden with eyes popped open. Outside, she replied, already on her way out. And then he rushed after her. Mom opened the front door. Grandma was still there with the goat. Jeffrey paused to see Mom's reaction on seeing the goat, but she was talking with Grandma normally. He became surprised, and then he summoned a little courage and went to them. But to his surprise, the head had changed into its normal form. Mom looked at him and then looked at Grandma. Mama, this your goat is very fat and beautiful. Please, can you sell it to me? I want to go with her to the city so I can take good care of her. And when she reproduces, I'll bring the kids for you, Mom said, giggling. Grandma raised her head and then feigned a smile. You mean this particular goat? She queried. Yes, Ma, Mom said, nodding sporadically. I have other goats. You can choose anyone from those ones over there, she said, pointing towards some goats sitting in their numbers and chewing their mouths non-stop. No, Mama, I like this one. In fact, I'm ready to pay any amount for this, said Mom. Really? You should be ready to pay big money or... Bring 500,000 and the goat is yours, Grandma said, laughing. Okay, I'll pay, Mom said, smiling. Grandma's eyes popped open all of a sudden. You will pay 500,000 just for this goat? Yes, Mama, I like it and I'm ready to pay for it. Really? Where did you get such an amount of money? Because I know you're not doing anything. From your husband, I guess, Grandma asked, staring at Mom. Well, I'm not selling this particular goat yet. Even if you offered me £1 million now, I still wouldn't let it go, Grandma added and continued feeding the goat. Mom turned and looked at Jeffrey. That's serious, she said, and then grabbed his hand. Okay, Ma, in case you change your mind, please let me know, Mom said, and then took Jeffrey in with her. Throughout that day and the day after, Mom and Jeffrey waited patiently for Grandma to go out, but she didn't. She finally did after the third day. Mom left Dad in their room, beckoned Jeffrey to come, and they went outside together. Mom said she had something to say to the goat. They went outside and searched everywhere, but the goat was nowhere to be found. They returned after their search. Jeffrey sat alone on his bed, wondering why Mama would turn Auntie Ibn Abo into a goat. The more he thought about it, the more confused he got. He then heaved a deep sigh and laid flat on the bed, on his back, with his gaze fixed. After a few minutes, he began to hear Grandma's voice from the outside. He hurried up, wore his slippers, and was rushing out of the room when Mom and he bumped into each other in the passage. Your Grandma is back, let's go outside, she whispered, and then grabbed his hand and they went outside together. Ah, Mama, you're back, Mom said with a grin, and at the same time scratching the back of her head. My dear, I am back, oh. I strolled out to see a friend, Grandma said, leaning her back on a wooden chair outside. That's great. Jeff, kindly get Mama a cup of water. Jeffrey turned swiftly to go get it, when Grandma said he shouldn't bother, and that she wasn't thirsty. Mom then picked a stool nearby and sat before Grandma. So how did you People's Day go? Grandma asked. Fine, oh. Mama, that goat I told you I liked. I was searching for her to feed her, even though you haven't yet changed your mind on selling her to me, but I didn't see her. Oh, the goat? Grandma asked, looking at Mom with one of her hands raised in the air. Sorry I didn't tell you. I took it to a friend's place. She had been disturbing me about it for a very long time now, that she wanted to help me take care of her, so that when she eventually reproduces, we would then share the kids. What? You took it to a friend's place? But Mama, I told you I was interested in her. I was even ready to buy it for any amount, Mom said. Is there anything you're not telling me? How come you're suddenly interested in having a goat? Because the last time I came to your place in the city, you told me that you do not like pets or animals. So why the sudden interest in having one now? Grandma queried, staring at Mom. Mom sat there, confused about what next to say as she began to scratch the back of her neck. Mama, it's nothing. It's just that I like that particular goat so much, she said. Transfer that likeness to one of those goats at the backyard. I'm even ready to give you one of them free of charge. Okay, I'll think about it, Mom said, stuttering. Mom's countenance changed immediately. She sat for a few more minutes without uttering a word, and then excused herself and went back in. Jeffrey didn't want to go after her immediately, so Grandma wouldn't notice anything. He was with her for some time, and then went in to see Mom. Mom was in tears, sitting on her bed, crying profusely like someone who had just lost a relative. He moved closer to her, squatted before her, and then held her in a tight hug. Ibn Abo was a good person. She was just too good to Mama and even treated her like her own mother. I just don't know why this happened to her. If what you told me is true, then I'm not safe here either, Mom said, sobbing. It's okay, Jeffrey said as tears welled up in his eyes. Well, a few days after was Christmas. Mom didn't even eat the meal Grandma prepared. She sat all day on her bed with Auntie Ibn Abo's thoughts in her head. Dad asked her several times to tell him what the problem was, but she said she was missing her late mom. That night, Jeffrey couldn't even sleep. He was on his bed, tossing and turning, and was having the same feeling he usually had if something bad was about to happen, or if something wasn't right. He would pick up his phone, surf the internet, and then go back offline. Something wasn't just right. Finally, after a few minutes, his eyes suddenly became so heavy. He was about dozing off when he started to hear silent whispers. He ignored it initially because it took time before the urge to sleep visited him, but then the whispers continued, and his eyes popped open all of a sudden. Who could that be? He asked himself rhetorically. He picked up his phone, gently opened the door, and then he tiptoed outside only to realize that it was actually Grandma's voice. He leaned on her door, eavesdropping, and he heard another shocker. Ibn Abo, I have sold the goat I transformed you into because people were beginning to suspect, and I'm sure that by now your body parts must be in people's pots of soup. I was told that you have a very strong soul, so I have caged your soul in this mirror. You will remain in there forever. Jeffrey froze as soon as he heard that. He just didn't know why God, or should he say the Creator, chose him for this mission. He tiptoed back into his room, sat on a chair by the corner of the room with his phone's torchlight on. He was so scared, so he sat there shivering, and after some time he dozed off. He then had a dream. He saw Auntie Ibn Abo's face looking so weary and sorrowful, and then after some time she changed into a ghost, kind of. She floated around in his room, then came before him in tears. Jeffrey, please, save my trapped soul, she whispered. Jeffrey jerked up from sleep all of a sudden, turned swiftly and started to look around his room. He was trembling in fear, that he couldn't stand on his feet. He grabbed his phone all of a sudden, flashed the corners of the room with its torchlight. He managed to get up, walked toward the window, and then he shut the open window all of a sudden with his face kept aside. He was too frightened to look outside. He walked back to the chair and then sat on it, waiting for morning to come, because he couldn't just wait to tell Mom what he heard again this time, and about the dream he had. But that night was the longest night ever. He would check the time. After seeing 1:05 a.m., he would check back after some time and would see 1:07 a.m. The time kept crawling and crawling till it was 6 a.m. He jumped up as soon as he heard Mom's voice and rushed out into her room. He opened the door and went in after knocking, and he asked Mom to come, that he needed to show her something. He was careful enough not to wake Dad because he didn't want him to know what was happening. Dad wouldn't even believe him. Mom followed, went with him to his room, and he narrated everything to her. Her jaw dropped in awe immediately. She then sat on his bed and started to cry. Later that day, Jeffrey prayed earnestly that Grandma should at least go out, so he could go into her room and confirm those things he heard. But she didn't. She finally did the following morning, which was on a market day. Jeffrey, tell your mother that I'm off to the market, she said. Okay, Ma, he replied with a nod. She walked towards the gate and then looked back again. Tell your mother to supervise the roasting of that bushmeat I kept in a basin in the backyard so that these boys that are coming to roast it will not steal from the meat. I don't trust those boys, she said, and he nodded again, and finally she left. He went to Mom first to tell her that Grandma had left the house and that Grandma asked her to supervise the roasting of that bushmeat in the basin. But Mom exclaimed all of a sudden. God forbid, she yelled, running her hand in circles above her head, snapping her fingers after each circle. I should supervise that bushmeat. Who knows if it's a human being she transformed into that bushmeat. She will return to meet it that way, except those boys roast it for her because I'm never going close to it, Mom said. Mom, the dream I had, Jeffrey said, staring into her eyes. Yeah? What about it? I want to go into her room to see things for myself. I want to see if God is trying to show me something concerning Auntie Ibn Abo. Mom's eyes popped open immediately. You want to go into Mama's room? See my armpit, she said, raising her hand. Did you find any hairs? She asked. Jeffrey, please mind yourself. I don't want any troubles from this grandmother of yours, so please stay out of her lane. But, Jeffrey said, but Mom cut in. No buts. We only have a few days more to spend here. Let's tread carefully. Be very, very careful, she said, dragging her earlobe. Jeffrey looked at her, and then he nodded. He went back into his room, sat on the chair, and the dream he had kept playing repeatedly in his head. He got up again, opened his door, and then approached Grandma's room. Walking on tiptoe, he kept turning left and right to be sure that Mom, Dad, or any of his siblings didn't see him. He quietly opened Grandma's door and then shut it slowly. He paused for a few seconds, leaning on the door, then summoned a little courage and went toward the mirror. He hadn't even entered Grandma's room since they arrived in the village. That was his first time after so many years. She had this very big standing mirror in her room, and as kids then, they would come into her room, smile before the mirror, even dance before it. They just loved to see themselves doing all sorts of activities before it, and to them then, it was fun. There was this very white linen now covering the mirror. Jeffrey stood before it, raised his hands in an attempt to take off the linen, but his heart began to pound so quickly, almost popping out of his chest. He summoned a little courage again, raised his hands, and gradually took off the linen. As soon as he did, Auntie Ibn Abo appeared, wearing a long white dress that covered both feet. Her face was looking exactly like the one he saw in his dream the previous night, while her loose hair fell on both shoulders. Jeffrey's jaw dropped in awe immediately, and the white linen he held dropped before him on its own. His legs became numb, and his tongue twisted so that he was unable to either scream or utter a word. Jeffrey, please save my trapped soul, she said, and tears started dropping down her face. Jesus. Jeffrey screamed all of a sudden, taking 2 steps backward. Jeffrey, please don't leave me here. My soul yearns for freedom and rest, she said, and this time with her head bowed. Jeffrey was still standing there, sweating profusely, frightened and in great shock when all of a sudden he heard Grandma's voice. Is there nobody at home? Grandma screamed again. Someone should please bring me a cup of cold water, she added. Jeffrey almost passed out on hearing Grandma's voice. He was filled with great fear and shock. He looked back swiftly, rushed to the door, and then twisted the door handle. He was about dashing out when Auntie Ibn Abo spoke again. Jeffrey, please, save me, she said, stretching forth one of her arms. He had already stepped out, but his hand was still on the door handle. And all of a sudden, he saw the linen lying on the floor. He didn't know whether to hurry up and pick it up, or just dash out of the room like that. But what if Grandma comes in and finds the mirror uncovered? Won't that be a big problem and trouble? He soliloquized with a hand under his chin. He turned swiftly, looking left and right, rushed back in, picked up the linen from the floor, and was about covering the mirror with it, when Auntie Ibn Abo's face changed from looking weary to a pitiful one. No, Jeffrey, please don't cover my face with that. I am already so uncomfortable here. Covering the mirror with that only causes me more heat, she said slowly, staring into his eyes, and then tears welled up in her eyes. Jeffrey paused for a few seconds, and tears started dropping down his face. But he had no other choice than to cover the mirror before he got caught. He raised the linen and was about covering the mirror again when she suddenly screamed with her face aside, and at the same time waving both hands at him. No, no, please. But Jeffrey had to shut his eyes with his teeth gnashed, and then he covered the mirror. He first held his breath as soon as he did, and then he heaved a heavy sigh while sobbing at the same time. He then turned and moved toward the door and started to wipe his tears with the hem of his shirt. He cleaned his face thoroughly so that Mom and the rest would not start asking him why his eyes were teary. He was still on it when the door opened all of a sudden, startling him. As soon as Grandma saw him, she was shocked. She stepped in, shut the door, and started to look sternly at him. But Jeffrey threw his face aside. She then turned and looked round her room. She giggled. Jeffrey, what are you doing here in my room? She asked, turning to him. Grease, Grandma, he said, stuttering with his head bowed. Those old pictures you used to give to us to watch when we were kids. I searched for them in your wardrobe, but couldn't find them, he said, twisting the hem of his shirt around his finger. Why didn't you tell me you wanted old pictures before I left for the market? Weren't you with me when I left? She questioned, but Jeffrey ignored her with his head still bowed. She hissed, approached her locker, unlocked it, and then brought out a bunch of old pictures. "What am I going to do with all these?" Jeffrey soliloquized, giving her an ugly stare from behind. Take them to your room to watch," she said, and then grabbed her earlobe. "Don't you ever come into my room without my notice." "Did you hear me?" she asked, and Jeffrey nodded sporadically. He took those pictures from her, turned and opened the door without a word, and then went into his room. As soon as he entered his room, he flung the pictures on the bed, scattering them all over. He sat on the tiled floor, holding both hands and with his head in between his laps, and he shed tears of sorrow and anguish. "Why must it be me?" he muttered, as tears found their way down his cheeks. A few hours later, he went to Mom's room when Dad stepped out, and he narrated what happened to her. She stood up all of a sudden with a dropped jaw and with both hands on her head. "You, this boy, you have finally succeeded in killing me," she exclaimed, rushed to her wardrobe, and started to pack the clothes in the wardrobe into the luggage. "What are you doing?" Jeffrey questioned. "We are leaving here this minute," she said, and continued packing. "Just like that?" "Without saving Auntie Ibn Abo?" he queried, and she looked up all of a sudden. "Are you stupid? Are you Merlin that you want to save a ghost trapped in a mirror?" she questioned, and he bowed his head, and then raised it again. "But what are you going to tell Dad?" "That is not a problem. Go into your room this minute and pack your things. We are leaving this place as soon as your father returns," she said. Jeffrey was almost opening his mouth to say something, but Mom could start beating him up if he tried saying otherwise. He got up, went into his room, and started to pack his things. But deep down, he didn't want to go without saving Auntie Ibn Abo. Dad arrived after about an hour, and to Jeffrey's surprise, he saw them putting their things in the trunk of the car. To this day, he doesn't even know what Mom said to Dad that made him consent to them leaving the village. But why the sudden change of mind? "I thought that you guys were going to stay back till the new year. And it's even getting late," Grandma said, standing before Dad. "Mama, something came up that we need to sort out immediately in the city. Don't worry, we shall be back by Easter." "May God spare our lives," Dad said, and Mom stood there feigning a smile. Well, they left the village, and Jeffrey couldn't stop thinking about Auntie Ibn Abo's ghost. It was so saddening that he couldn't even help her trapped soul. Whenever her children came to visit, or he went to theirs to spend some time, it broke his heart even more each time they talked about their mother and how much they missed her. After about 6 months, Dad was out of the country, but he got a call that Grandma had passed, and he called Mom to inform her. Mom was so happy, but Jeffrey was sad somehow, knowing fully well that Grandma had trapped a soul in a mirror before she passed, that he didn't even have a clue of setting free. Well, they were meant to go to the village, and they all did, including Jeffrey's cousins. But as soon as they reached, they were told by Grandma's younger brother that Grandma was to be buried in 3 days and wished to be buried alongside her mirror. But Dad refused and told him that he wanted Grandma to be kept in the mortuary for about a week, so that by then he would be around, and that he was yet to understand why Grandma wished to be buried alongside her mirror. Unknown to them, Grandma belonged to a secret society and must be buried in 3 days. Grandma's corpse was kept in the mortuary as instructed by Dad. Her room was also under lock and key by God knows who. On the 3rd day, very early in the morning, Mom received a call from Dad, telling her that some people were already at the mortuary to pick up Grandma's corpse. "Who are they?" Mom screamed all of a sudden. Jeffrey was in bed, but he had woken up. As soon as he heard Mom's scream, he jerked up and dashed out of the room into hers. The call had already ended, but the phone was still in her hand, which was suspended in the air. She raised her head as soon as Jeffrey opened the door, while her mouth was still agape. "Mom, I heard you scream." "What is it?" he asked, sitting beside her, and then she told him what Dad said. Jeffrey was still with her in her room when they started to hear chants coming from outside the compound, and his uncle, who was Dad's younger brother, had already left the house. So there were no very close adult relatives around, except Grandma's people. Mom and Jeffrey looked at each other, then sprinted outside the gate, where they met his siblings and cousins already there, watching them. And lo and behold, they were Grandma's cult members. They started to sprinkle something that looked like blood before the gate and around the house. They all became so scared and started to look at each other. And then Mom whispered to Jeffrey to go bring her phone. He left and arrived with the phone in the twinkle of an eye. Mom stylishly took pictures of them, hurried back in, called Dad, and then forwarded the pictures to him. "Don't worry, all will be taken care of," Dad said. After a few minutes, they were still by the gate when they started to hear gunshots from afar. They all ran back into the house and started to peek through the windows. They were armed army officers. They shot into the air again as soon as they arrived at the gate, and the cult members fled, running as fast as their legs could carry them. One of the officers came in and asked to see Mom, saying that they needed to go to the mortuary and that they wanted one of them to go with them to identify the corpse so as to prevent Grandma's cult members from claiming it. Mom called Dad immediately to inform him of the recent development and to ask him if he was the one responsible for the mobilization of the military men. He said yes, and then asked Mom and Jeffrey to go with them to the mortuary, which they did without hesitation. On getting there, they met other cult members too, all dressed in pure red, with a black veil tied around their necks. Grandma's corpse had already been deposited in a white coffin and was ready to be moved into the ambulance. Mom and Jeffrey were so shocked, and they stood there staring at them. They were confused because none of them knew who permitted them to take the corpse, and they also did not know which family member signed for the corpse to be released. Mom opened her bag, brought out her phone, and started to dial Dad's number. One of the army officers then approached the cult members, carrying his gun on his shoulder. "You are not leaving here with this corpse," he said with a baritone voice, pointing at the coffin at the same time. "You lie. Who the hell are you?" one of the cult members questioned with a squeezed face. But the army officer ignored him and started to walk back and forth slowly before them with the gun still on his shoulder, and at the same time staring into their eyes. Dad wasn't picking up. Mom just kept recalling his phone and was in a panic. "Who gave the order for this corpse to be released to you people?" the army officer questioned. "I did," they heard all of a sudden. The voice came from one of the rooms, and the owner of the voice then walked out majestically. Lo and behold, it was Jeffrey's uncle. Their jaws dropped as soon as they saw him, and Mom slowly dropped the phone from her ear. "Hello, dear." "Hello, hey, hello." Dad's voice echoed from the phone, but Mom was too shocked to the extent that she had totally forgotten that she was on a call. The army officer turned and looked at them, and then at him. "Who are you?" the officer queried. "I'm the late woman's second son. Let the dead bury their dead," he said with confidence. That was how he ended up betraying them, because he was initially on their side. And now he came to sign for his late mother's corpse to be released without even letting Dad, his elder brother, or any of them know. If only he knew what his late mother did to his wife, Ibn Abo. Mom then managed to answer her call and narrated what was happening to Dad. "Never!" Dad exclaimed all of a sudden, and then ended the call. After a few seconds, the army officer's phone rang all of a sudden. He picked it up and then placed it on his left ear. "Okay, sir," he said, and then ended the call. He signaled his colleagues, and they all raised their guns. The army officers fired into the air all of a sudden, and the cult members again all took to their heels. Grandma's corpse was deposited back in the mortuary, and they left for home. Throughout that day, Jeffrey wasn't even himself and was feeling so uneasy. And Mom too could not even do anything all through. All that they witnessed was just like a Nollywood movie. Later that night, none of them could shut their eyes. They heard footsteps around the house, followed by the sound of ceramic plates being broken in the kitchen by no one. They all ran into Mom's room, including Jeffrey's cousins, and at exactly 1 a.m. they started to hear a loud cry and then a voice. "Allow them to bury me." They heard in echoes all of a sudden, and they all clung to each other. "I say, allow them to bury me." They heard again, and this time with a thunderous sound coming from the back of the house. Then there was this heavy breeze that nearly blew off the curtains. Mom jumped up and hurried to the window to shut it, but a face in white with blood dripping from its eyes appeared outside the window all of a sudden. It was that of a very old woman. And then a force lifted Mom with her head touching the ceiling and then slammed her on the bed. She passed out immediately. The rest of them screamed, holding each other in a tight embrace. Grandma's people that were around, including Jeffrey's uncle, sprinted into the room and then told them they heard nothing at all that night, not even the sound of the ceramic plates being broken. They were tormented day and night, and some relatives later advised that they allow the cult members to bury the corpse. But Dad blatantly refused. He then told them that he was coming back the following day, which was on the 6th day. Even though Jeffrey hadn't slept for days, also thinking of how to release Auntie Ibn Abo's soul before Grandma's burial, he managed to close his eyes that night. He dreamt and saw Dad being chased by a figure carrying a machete. He called him that morning when he woke up and then narrated his dream to him, and also told him to postpone his trip. "So you're trying to tell me not to come home as a prophet that you are, Abi? I should remain here and not come for my mother's burial," he raged. "No, sir," Jeffrey said, and then Dad cut in. "My friend, get out," he said, and then ended the call. Around 5 p.m. that evening, they were in the living room when a breaking news came up on the TV. The aircraft that Dad boarded had crashed. Thank you very much for watching. We have one more amazing episode to go. If you've enjoyed the story so far, please drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification so you won't miss any updates. Thank you, and remember, we love you.